We were looking at the causes or events leading up to the Civil War, and we had left off on, let me see if we can do this. We left off on 1852, the fictional book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which the anti-slavery novel depicts slavery and the treatment of blacks very, very poorly. So as a quick review, we have the events that lead to the Civil War, and we're going to go back 40 years. Civil War is 1861 to 1865. 1820, the Missouri Compromise that said anything below the 36th parallel would be slave states. Anything above the 36th parallel was going to be free states. That stays in existence for about 30 years. In 1831, we have the Nate Turner's Rebellion, where the slaves overthrow the slave plantations in Virginia. Then we have the Wilmot Proviso. That was a result of some legislation they tried to pass out of the Mexican War that never was passed. We had the 1850 Compromise, and then 1852 Uncle Tom's Cabin. Then in 1854 to 1861, we had two territories opening up, Kansas and Nebraska. And we have the incidences called the Bleeding Kansas. And what we decided from the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was that we were going to allow the states popular sovereignty to decide whether or not they wanted to have slavery in their states. Now, this act of Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act voids the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Missouri Compromise was everything below the 36th parallel, slave state, everything above, free state. Now we're saying, no, the states themselves, as they enter into statehood, they will have the right to have popular sovereignty, the right to vote on whether or not they want to have it be a slave state. Well, these are territories, and from the series from 1854 until 1861, when these states will become, or when these territories will become states, there is an act of people moving in trying to sway. You had the pro-slavery group move to one part of Kansas. The anti-slavery group moved to another part of Kansas. The anti-slavery group is backed by the Republican Party. The slavery group is backed by the Democratic Party. And they're at odds. And along the way, you're going to kill numerous people and shed a whole lot of blood for the right to decide. Finally, eventually, Kansas will enter into the United States as a free state. Next, you have, this is in 1861 that you're going to have Kansas become a state, but in 1854, this Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. But then in 1857, one of the most largest Supreme Court cases ever, a guy by the name of Dred Scott, a slave named Dred Scott, sued his owner, who died and then passed it off to his son by the name of Sanford for his freedom. And the Supreme Court ruled out of that. Mr. Scott had been owned, and when he was a slave, they had moved to two other states along the way that were free. And then this is crazy, he had moved from being in a slave state to a free state. So he said he got some lawyers to back him and bring it to the courts to get his freedom. And initially in the state of Missouri, no, I'm sorry, not in the state of Missouri. In the state of Illinois, he had the state court rule that he was free. And then that was overturned by the state of Missouri, who said he was not free. And it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, whether they were free or slaves, were not American citizens, and they could never ever sue the federal government. They could never ever vote in national elections. This was an enormous decision because it broke precedent. It's a great example of where you have a judicial decision being done in place of should be a legislative decision. And this is what you'll hear a lot of times when you'll hear that the courts have made a ruling on something. I'm going to use the most controversial one. The most recent one was gay marriage, where the Constitution says, and they are on pretty solid grounds here, when they say you can't discriminate based on race, color, creed, or sex on marriage. But there is nowhere in the Constitution that says that gay marriage is protected. And so what a lot of people would come back and say is, because it's not stated in the Constitution, this should be decided by the states. And the states should be the ones that decide whether or not you want gay marriage in your state or not. This is the way it is rolled out. And so you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act saying popular sovereignty, but in this Supreme Court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford, it ruled that slave owners could actually take their slaves into free states because slaves would never be a citizen. They can never ever sue the federal government. And it's a court case that's going to set the courts back a whole bunch and the country back. This is going to be a big issue because, again, whether you like it or not, what you can say is this doesn't align with precedents of previous court cases. I'm sure if you felt like slaves should be in place, you could probably find something that says it does align with it, but it seems to be moving away from what legislatively and the courts had decided in the past on slaves. This is going to take the Nebraska-Kansas Act of popular sovereignty in states and throw it out. So it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the people want to do or the legislative branch wants to do, because the Supreme Court says the Constitution is saying that slaves are not citizens, they're property, and so they don't have that right. This is 1857. Then in 1859, John Brown, an abolitionist from the state of Connecticut, will have a armed slave revolt where he will go in and he will take a U.S. arsenal where guns are stored and kept for the U.S. Army. He will overthrow that, and he will take the guns out of a place in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and he will take those guns and he'll kill 5 pro-slavery people and 1 free black man. He'll also have 10 in his party killed, and eventually he'll be caught and he'll be hung for this. But this and all the other events are leading more and more people to draw a definite line in the sand that's going to bring us to the war. Now we're at 1859. President Abraham Lincoln is going to win election for the Republican Party, who was anti-slavery in 1860. The Civil War will break out in 1861. So we're going to stop there. We've now laid the foundation. We're going to introduce you to a few more players, but we're getting a good picture of what is laying in front of us as a nation as we get ready to enter the 1860 election, and the tempers and the temperance of the country it's high. So let's stop there, and we'll come back and visit again next week.